Thank you so much, Deb. It's always such a pleasure to be here with Future Church, and it's a special pleasure to be here with Professor Taylor, who is an incredibly eminent and versatile scholar. And I had the very great honor of getting to work with Professor Taylor in co-writing an article that we're going to be telling you about today. So I'm going to start sharing my screen, and Professor Taylor will give the second half of the talk. So I'm going to be, so here's our talk, The Magdalen Mystery. And it's really nice, the prayer that Russ gave, because it ties in with all the sort of theories about what the word Magdalene means. And so this is sort of the central question of this article that we wrote in the Journal of Biblical Literature, which it was published in December 2021, and the name of the article is The Meaning of Magdalene, a Review of Literary Evidence. And it sort of started because some of you know, because I've done another Women Erased lecture, I published a different article that argues sort of for the possibility that Lazarus' sister Mary is Mary Magdalene, and the text of John's Gospel might have gotten tweaked a bit. And so, because I had sort of put forward that theory, I'm interested in this idea that Mary comes from a place called Magdala, because that doesn't work if she's from Bethany, right? And Professor Taylor had written an article in Palestinian Exploration Quarterly that talks, first of all, about how problematic it is to assign the word Magdalene to simply reference a specific town, because first of all, there's many towns that have the word Migdal in them at that time, so we don't know which Migdal could have been spoken about. And Professor Taylor also acknowledged the possibility, because the word Migdal, and I'll talk about this in a moment, the word Magdala in Aramaic means tower. So the question really is, does Mary come from a town called Tower, or is Mary herself a tower? So Professor Taylor had published on that. So I reached out to her and I said, well, I have another angle here. And that's, what about the reception of her name, the patristic reception, what all the church fathers were saying? Because I realized that nobody had looked at that really in depth. And so she said, sure, let's do it, which was honestly kind of miraculous that she was kind enough to do that, because Professor Taylor's a very senior scholar, and I was just a PhD candidate. She's a very generous lady, but it turned out quite well, because we got published in a top-tier journal, and it got featured in the National Catholic Reporter and Religion News Service. Some of you may have seen that. So basically, the central question in this article that was published in December is, how clear is it that Hey Magdalene, the Magdalene, this title that is associated with Mary, how clear is it that that's understood to refer as her coming from a city called Magdala, located beside the Sea of Galilee? So this Magdala by the Sea of Galilee, probably a lot of people here on this call have perhaps gone to the Holy Land, and they've visited this place called Magdala, and it's an extraordinary place. They've unearthed, I think in 2009, they unearthed this synagogue, a first century synagogue, and so it's really quite striking. And there's also this stone that they uncovered called the Magdala stone, and you can see here. Here's a little snippet of a New York Times article talking about the Magdala stone, and you can see, the site is the presumed hometown of Mary Magdalene, and it's very powerful. It's an incredible stone. I'm not much of an archaeologist, but I do know that the stone itself was a big find. And so there's sort of a whole complex that's been built around this synagogue and this Magdala stone. And also there's this whole discussion, oh, this is Mary Magdalene's hometown. And if you go there, which I have gone, they will say this is Mary Magdalene's hometown. But it is a bit problematic, as Professor Taylor had pointed out in her Palestinian Exploration Quarterly article. And she'll tell you more about her research, because she's more of an expert in the Aramaic and the Hebrew than I am. But this is what I do know, what I've learned along the way, that basically the Hebrew root word gadal means to be great or large. And when you put a preformative mem, it sort of, on the word, it sort of makes it into, it can sort of turn it into sort of like a noun. So Magdal is the Hebrew word for tower, and Magdal is Aramaic, is a later dialect, and they both mean tower. Syriac, which is an even later stage of Aramaic, if you were to look at Syriac manuscripts and you were to translate it, her name is Mary Magdalitha, and the itha is sort of like an ending that is in person. And in Greek, that's you have a similar ending, ene, which is sort of it's like a feminine ending for a person. So basically this itha in Syriac and this ene in Greek basically are sort of like S. Like if I'm from Portland, so you could call me the Portlandess. I'm from Portland, Oregon, so you could call me the Portlandess. So basically, the word Magdalene means tower S. That's kind of like just the most basic meaning of the word. If you were to go very literal, and Professor Taylor will go into this more in detail. But the question is it the town called Tower that she's from, or is it Mary that's the Tower S? So what we decided to do was to look at all the church fathers and to do a survey. And so, and also to begin with the Gospel of Luke, as Russ did, as he talked about in his prayer, she does get a special name in the Gospel of Luke. The other Gospel writers refer to her as Maria he Magdalene, or Mariam he Magdalene, Mary the Magdalene. But Luke changes it a little bit. In Luke 8, he refers to her as Mary called Magdalene, Maria he Kalumene Magdalene, Mary the one called Magdalene. And he also has another kind of strange formulation at the end of the gospel, the Magdalene Mary, he Magdalene Maria. So Luke has a slightly different formulation of her name, and it sort of raises some questions because, and I know that this is a rather intimidating list, and I apologize for the huge amount of text on this slide, but it's quite informative because basically Professor Taylor and I kind of went through all of Luke and Acts because the book of Acts is also written by the same author. And we sort of looked for wherever this word kaleo, which is the basis of kalumene. Kaleo is a verb that means to call. And if you say kalumenos or kalumene, that's masculine versus feminine, you're saying the one called, the one being called. So if you were to look at the other uses of kalumene and kalumenos throughout Luke and Acts, you can see that this author does not actually use that participle, kalumene, when referencing a place of origin. Generally, it's a description. For instance, Elizabeth is she who is called barren. Simon is called the zealot. Martha has a sister called Mary. Obviously, these are not location names. It's basically just means called. The only one from this entire list, and also as Russ pointed out, Simon called Peter. The only one from this entire list that might even reference a place is Judas called Iscariot. But Professor Taylor, because she's an absolutely incredible scholar, has a different article talking about how that's a very problematic assertion as well. It may, and she can tell you more about that, but I believe she concludes that it could mean choked up. But she can tell you more about that. So basically, in the vast majority of cases, when Luke uses the word kalumene, Simon called the black, Judas called Barsabbas, Simon called Peter, a young man called Saul, this word kalumenos or kalumene is a nickname. It's almost certainly a nickname. So the fact that we know that Luke probably had Mark's gospel. Mark's gospel says Maria he Magdalene, Mary the Magdalene, and Luke has changed it. Why did Luke change the formulation of Mary's name from Maria he Magdalene to Maria he Kalumene Magdalene, Mary called Magdalene? Whatever Luke's reason, whenever Luke uses this word, it seems to be to indicate a nickname. So for Luke, it doesn't seem to be that this is her place of origin. If you were to look at places where Luke does talk about people according to their place of origin, Luke doesn't use kalumene. For instance, Jesus ho Nazaraios, Jesus the Nazarene. Joseph apo Arimatheos, Joseph from Arimathea. Lucius ho Kyrenaios, Lucius the Cyrene. Sorry for all the Greek. I know some of you read Greek, but we've translated it for you. So probably the most striking place where Luke acts shows the difference between kalumene participles and location participles is found in Acts 13, verse 1 at the bottom. You can see that it says, Simeon ho kalumenos niger, Simeon, the one called black, kai Lucius ho Kyrenaios, and Lucius the Cyrenian. So you can see that when it's a nickname like the black, it uses kalumene. And when it's a place that someone's from, Luke just says the and then the name. So Luke has changed Maria Magdalene to put this kaleo participle instead, implying that Luke has changed a formulation that could imply that she might be from a place called Magdala and change it to it being more of a nickname. That seems to be what Luke is up to. If you're just to look at how Luke treats names and locations throughout Luke Acts. So that's the first piece of information that seems quite relevant to trying to understand. And it's also sort of the oldest of all of the sort of commentators, you could say, on her name. So this Luke Acts is very important information. Next, we've got Origen of Alexandria. Probably a lot of you have heard of him. He's a 3rd century, very important church father. And he actually does talk about the meaning of Mary Magdalene's name. He thinks that she is from a place called Magdala, but he doesn't focus on where it's from. And in fact, he doesn't seem to know where Magdala is. He just says, Magdala, that place is magnifying. Origen is focusing more on the meaning of her name. And then he says how appropriate. Maria Magdalena of magnification, she followed him and she ministered to him and she looked at the mystery of his passion. She was among the prominent ones. So even though he thinks that she's from a place called Magdala that he doesn't identify, he seems to think that the meaning of her name it's more important that it shows her prominence and her magnification as an important follower of Jesus. And in our article, we point out that at the time that Origen wrote this, he was living in Caesarea, and you can actually walk to the place that today is considered Magdala from Caesarea. And so Origen was always very careful about noting place names. So if he had known that she came from this place that today scholars think is Migdal Nunaya or Migdal Tsebaya, or Terrachea, and Professor Taylor will go more into that, Origen would have spoken more specifically about that because he was really particular about these sorts of things. And this was his neighborhood. This is where he lived at the time. So the fact that Origen doesn't say anything about that suggests that Origen does not actually know the place that she's from. And that's actually really contradicts the thesis that everybody knew that Mary came from this place by the Sea of Galilee. Origen says nothing about the exact location of this place. Next, we get to Eusebius of Caesarea, sorry, and he's in the 4th century. And he also comments, and he has a completely different idea. He thinks that there's 2 Mary Magdalenes. This is because there's a little bit of a contradiction in John's description of the encounter with Jesus on Easter morning. So basically, Matthew says that she comes to the tomb late on the Sabbath. And then in John, it says that she comes early in the morning. So Eusebius says there can be no contradiction in scripture, so there must be 2 Marys. And he thinks that she comes from a place not called Magdala. He thinks that she comes from a place called Magdalen. Again, he doesn't say where he thinks this is. But what's more important is that Eusebius does know a place called Magdala. And Eusebius lived in Caesarea, and he made this work called the Onomasticon, which, by the way, was translated by Joan Taylor. She's such an incredible scholar. She should be giving a lot of this presentation, but she translated Eusebius's Onomasticon. And throughout the Onomasticon, he's very interested in place names. And he tells you exactly where they are, place names from the Bible, I should say. He's very interested in specifying them for his readers so that they know where to find it. He knows a place called Magdala, but guess where it is? It's in Judea. Nowhere near the Sea of Galilee. He associates it with a place in Judea that we know as Migdal Gad. So Eusebius is citing, when he cites Magdala of the tribe of Judah, he's saying that's where the place is. He's citing Joshua 15:37, and it is not by the Sea of Galilee. And in any case, Eusebius does not associate his two Marys from Magdalen with this place he knows called Magdala. I think that this piece of information from Eusebius is actually devastating to the argument from this place by the Sea of Galilee, because Eusebius actually lived there. Again, Caesarea was walking distance from the place today known as Magdala. He does not think that Mary came from there, and he does not even think that that place is called Magdala. The place he knows as Magdala is in the south, in Judea. So I think this piece from Eusebius is one of the biggest pieces of information that we uncovered in our article. And there's just one last thing that I'll talk about before handing it over to Professor Taylor, and that is Saint Jerome. Probably a lot of you know Saint Jerome as the guy who translated the Vulgate from Greek and Hebrew into Latin. He was asked to do so by Pope Damasus. And he is obviously an exceptional linguist. In his letter to Hedibia, written in 412 CE, he says that Mary received her name Tower S because she deserved to see the risen Christ first before the apostles. So Jerome is one of the best linguists in the world. And he again lived in Palestine at the time that he was writing this. He associated Mary with no place called Tower of something. He does not mention a Magdala by the Sea of Galilee. And Jerome seems to think that probably Mary Magdalene was the sister of Martha. And there's a place in Bethany where Mary and Martha are venerated. And it's more likely that that's where Jerome thought that Mary Magdalene came from. The point here is that there is no consensus in antiquity. Everybody has a different idea about the meaning of her name and where she's from. So modern scholars really shouldn't be saying that we have a consensus, because we don't know. So I'm going to hand it over now to the real expert, Joan Taylor.
Well, thank you, Libbie. And actually, it's been a real delight working with Libbie. It's really fantastic to see a young scholar like her really making such incredible inroads in terms of all of these wonderful things she's discussing. And this is not the only article she has written. As she said, you know, she is a powerhouse of work at the moment. She's really presenting a lot in terms of scholarly literature. Now, let me go from the beginning. In the second part on Mary Magdalene's name, as Libbie said, all sorts of different ways of representing Mary's name in the Gospels, but particularly we're interested in this term Mary called Magdalene, because it indicates it's some kind of nickname. You've got to remember that Jesus himself is called Nazarios, Nazarene, and he would have had this nickname, the Nazarene. And in the ancient world, they did love puns. They liked multiple meanings, and we can see that in the way Matthew 2:23 talks about Jesus as he will be called a Nazarene, and we're supposed to think that in itself is significant. So to be called something, to have a nickname, might indicate something about you. And I'm not going to talk about the meaning of Nazarene, but other people have. And it's not just about coming from Nazareth. So when we think about ancient nicknames, think about, you know, what they really mean, what they represent in terms of the character being described. Now, it can mean provenance, it can refer to provenance, and we've got specific instances of women coming from a particular place, as Libbie said, that Greek ending can be someone coming from Portland, coming from anywhere. And in this example from Bet Sherim, we've got Anna, daughter of Matatiah, Bisarine, we've got Papyri referring to a Mariam Engadine, Babata Maozine, not with a definite article. We do have one definite article in terms of our evidence from archaeology another papyrus where we've got Salome the Galilean. That would have been her nickname, the Galilean, in a context in which everyone else was Judean. So she was called Galileet, from Galilee. In all these instances, in calling people by a particular nickname, it's generally men that gets called by a nickname in our inscriptions. And we have to notice how Mary is called by a nickname instead of the usual terminology for describing a woman, which is Mary, the mother of someone, Mary, the sister, Mary, the wife. It's the relationship a woman has with a man that is far more important in terms of identifying who they are in ancient inscriptions on ossuaries and papyri or whatever. And Mary just gets this one thing. Mary Magdalene is just the Magdalene. There's something unusual about that in terms of describing an ancient woman. So just to say it's about her provenance is a bit limiting in terms of the possible meanings of her nickname. So Libbie has talked about Origen from the 3rd century identifying a place called Magdala, okay, that she came from, but actually what's important to Origen is that it's got this meaning of magnification, magnifying, notably not the tower. He doesn't go for that meaning. He doesn't think of a place called the tower of something. He thinks of a place called magnification. And elsewhere, if he's going to look for a place called magnification, he finds one in Numbers 33:7 or Ezekiel 29:10 and 36. It's this place called Magdolos, which is a stopping place on the way from Egypt, so nowhere near Galilee. Eusebius, as Libbie said, he's got another Magdala in Judea. He talks about a village called Magdalene. Again, he doesn't identify Magdalene from where Mary came from as the tower. We only get this idea that Magdala means tower from Jerome in the late 4th or early 5th century. But he says, as Libbie says, it's not a translation of a place. It's because Mary was a tower of faith. So it's a symbolic term. And all of these had some understanding that Mary was really from a village. It wasn't an important city, it was just a village. And we get this represented in an anti-Christian writer called Macarius Magnes. He hated Christians, he was going to write against them in all sorts of different ways. And he dismisses the Magdalene Mary as a common woman, one who came from some very miserable little village and who had been once possessed by 7 demons, and with her another very obscure Mary, who was also in Matthew's Gospel, also herself a village woman, and to a few others who are utterly unknown. Jesus appeared in terms of his resurrection. But this idea that she came from a miserable little village seems to have been the common paradigm for understanding her provenance. And, people didn't really know where it was, but, maybe it was called Magdalene or Magdala. But at some point, Jerome's notion of the nickname Magdalene as originating in this idea of a tower, a place called Magdal, a tower of something, comes about. And what actually happens, it probably is associated with Byzantine pilgrimage, because in the Byzantine pilgrimage phenomenon, you get all sorts of places identified as sites of memory, sites of commemoration where people can go, remember the gospel story and pray. So this is an important reshaping of Palestine in the 4th, 5th century. So when they looked around, what could they see? They could see a lot of places being called a tower of something. Towers were built all over the place, as we know from Jesus' story of a man dug a pit for the winepress and built a tower. Towers were built to guard agricultural land. A lot of places got then called Tower of Something. And we can see the evidence for that in both rabbinic and early Christian literature, where we've got all kinds of places called Tower. We could expand from this map all through Galilee and also through Judea. You can see Migdal Gad down in Judea there. This is, as Libbie said, Eusebius's Magdala. You've got Migdal Thawatha on the coast. You've got some places like Caesarea Maritima, originally called Stratton's Tower, so that would have been another Migdal. You've got the Tower of Siloam that Jesus reports as collapsing in the Gospel of Luke in Jerusalem. You've got a little place called Migdal Nunaya, just near Tiberias. You've got other places we don't know where they were. They're mentioned in rabbinic literature like Migdal Sabaya, Migdal Gedor. No one has clearly defined where they are. And the idea that Mary might have had something to do with a place called Tower of Something, but it wasn't specific, keeps going on through time. And we can see that in the statement by Ishtawad of Merv, who was a Assyrian bishop in the 9th century. And when he writes about Magdalene, what Magdaletha in the Syriac means, he says, well, according to some, it's because she had lived in Straton's Tower. Others say from the Tower of Siloa or Siloam. Others that Mary is the sister of Lazarus was a harlot who was called Magdaletha from the tower, which she built for herself with the wages of harlotry, and so on and so forth. Then others say Mary, the sister of Lazarus, was not a harlot, but chaste and holy and a keeper of the commandments of God. And when our Lord cured her, she increased in virtuous works until she was called Mary Magdalene from the Tower of Righteousness, which she had built for herself, which raised her up to heaven, that is, made her ascend. So even in the 9th century, there are people who don't know what the name Magdalene actually means, and there's this speculation in terms of its meaning. But as Libbie said, we've got Magdala by the Sea of Galilee, and many of you will have visited Magdala by the Sea of Galilee. And so how on earth did we get this site, you may ask? Surely it must have been an ancient site. We go there, we see the archaeology of this site, we see the synagogue. This is important. And in fact, it all starts, this story starts in terms of identification of Magdala as the definitive Roman Magdala in the 19th century, when a Palestinian fishing village called Al-Majdal, which means the tower, was identified as the Magdala of Mary's name. Now, you can see in this 19th century map from the Palestine Exploration Fund that Al-Majdal is located about 5.5 kilometers, a few miles north of Tiberias on the western side of the Sea of Galilee. So, and we know that Palestinian villages can retain very ancient names. So Engedi by the Dead Sea preserves the name of En-Gedi. El Ariha preserves the name of ancient Jericho. So it's reasonable to think, okay, this might preserve the name of an ancient town called Magdala. And certainly, we can see in the 6th century, there was an ancient town called Magdala here, or a pilgrim stopping place rather than an ancient town, I should say, correct myself. And there's various testimonies to pilgrims, Byzantine pilgrims, stopping at this site and identifying it as Magdala. Even in the 8th century, the house of the Magdalen is here, and on through the Crusaders, through to the Golden Legend in the 14th and 13th, 14th century, we've got references to a site called Magdala on the Sea of Galilee, and that is confirmed by the archaeology of the site. There's all sorts of Byzantine through to Crusader remains at Magdala. Now that is a very secure identification of a site. It's a Byzantine pilgrimage site. It was developed quite a lot at this time, and so we can say, yes, the Palestinian fishing village is retaining the name of Magdala. But was that actually ancient Magdala? Was that the site in the 1st century when Jesus was traveling around the Sea of Galilee? Did Mary come from this place called Magdala? Well, there's a problem with that, because we know that some Byzantine sites have retained their name into the modern time, but they have overlaid the ancient name of the site. So, for example, in Bethany, if you visit modern Bethany, it's actually the Palestinian town of El Azariah, and that takes its name from the Byzantine great church of Constantine, the Lazarium. It doesn't retain the name of Bethany. It takes its name from a Byzantine name. So there's no reason to think that a Byzantine name preserves an ancient name. We've got to be very careful. So there's the synagogue that you've seen in the previous slide, and very important synagogue, but the question is this Mary's hometown? Well, the excavators and various other people before them have gone to this location called Magdalen and said, in rabbinic literature, and said, now this is the definitive Magdala. Magdalen was close to Tiberias. This must be the Magdala we are excavating at this site by the Sea of Galilee. The trouble is that if you look closely at rabbinic literature, Magdalen, which just means the fish tower, lies precisely, very precisely, one rabbinic meal from the exit of Tiberias, and that's in the Babylonian Talmud, and that distance is 1 kilometer, or about 0.6 of a present-day mile. And what is really wonderful is people have found the very wall of Byzantine Tiberias, and that is located in Hayakon Street. And if you did an aerial map of Tiberias, you could see where the wall was located. The most of Roman and Byzantine Tiberias lay south of the present town of Tiberias. And if you count just exactly that distance up to the present-day Magdala on the north of Mount Arbel, it's too far. In fact, 1 mil is much further south. It's in the northern part of Tiberias itself, present-day Tiberias itself. And this was very important to the rabbis, in fact, because it was a Sabbath day's journey and you wouldn't want to infringe the Sabbath. So we've got to locate Magdal further south. It can't be the Magdala of the Byzantine pilgrimage site, but it's possible that Byzantine developers, those who developed the pilgrimage site, took the name of Magdal and pushed it further north to develop their distinctively Christian site. So that's where you look out. If you were in Magdal, you look to the north to Mount Arbel, and present-day Magdala is just behind the cliff. The other thing to note is what they're excavating in Magdala now, the present-day at Magdala now, is a city. It is not a village. There's well laid out streets, there's very well built houses, there's public buildings, there's water systems, and everywhere they go in this region, they're finding more and more remains of this ancient city. The full extent is still unknown. The likelihood is it is this city called Tarakea. Now, niftily, the excavators then go, yes, well, Tarakea was ancient Magdala. even though we know Magdalene was far nearer to Tiberius. There's nothing, absolutely nothing in ancient sources that identifies Tarakeia with Magdalene, any place called Magdala. It's just a zero when we look at our ancient evidence. We do have from Josephus an identification of where Tarakeia was located. It was located, lo and behold, about 5.5 kilometers from Tiberias. So it's good. Tarakeia, we can accept it was Tarakeia, but it wasn't an ancient Magdala. If you want to know the argument in terms of how they identified as ancient Magdala, it kind of runs like this. There's a place named Magdalenia in rabbinic literature just north of Tiberias, otherwise known as Magdala. The name Magdalenia means fish tower. The name Tarakeia means place of preservation or salting. The Galileans preserved and salted fish, and therefore Tarakeia and Magdalenia are the same place. But we would question whether that is really logical. So just to end, what we really want to stress is we've got to see Mary Magdalene as coming from a village. She was a village woman. And we, when we think about the meaning of the name Magdala, we can think of different options, that in some way she was a toweress, as Russ said. Could also mean a fortress, a stronghold in some way. It can also mean she could have been very tall. That might indicate her status. It could mean something to do with magnification. It might have something to do with the significance of Luke 8:2 or 16:9, where 7 demons go out of her. It was a very great miracle that she was healed in this way, or she was enlarged by these demons. You know, all sorts of things are possible. There could be multiple overlapping meanings. One of them could be that she comes from a village called Magdal something, but we've got to remember that Bethany is called a castellum in the Latin Vulgate. It could be they're even thinking of Bethany as this tower, and it's a nickname like other important disciples. She is the Magdalene. Thank you. Stop share.
So, wow. Thank you so much for that wonderful, so in-depth and very, very, very scholarly presentation. So what we want to do now is we're getting people clapping and so forth. Yay. We would like to open it up for people to have questions. And so if you can use that little reaction button at the bottom to raise your hand. If you can't figure that out, if you do this, I will eventually see you. So let's just get started with some. Oh, here's my friend from India, Evangeline. We'll let her start out with her question. Go ahead, Evangeline.
Thank you, Rose. I wanted to, first of all, thank you both for your presentation and quickly go to that reference in John 19:25-27, where women at the cross, Mary Magdalene is named. But then the beloved disciple gets a little kind of, blurry, I would say. And I'm wondering whether Mary Magdalene is the beloved disciple, except for the change of grammar, referring to as a he, a disciple, beloved disciple, whether it was actually Mary Magdalene herself.
That's a complicated question. We know that some texts like the Gospel of Philip and the Gospel of Mary do reference Mary as specially beloved by Jesus. And so we might wonder where they got that from. The Gospel of Philip seems to have the passage that you mention in front of them, because they mention the same list of Marys that always walk with Jesus. If you're looking at the text of John, it's a difficult argument to make, particularly because of John chapter 20, when it says that Mary Magdalene runs to Simon Peter and to the other disciple whom Jesus loved. So it seems in John chapter 20 that this other disciple is a different person than Mary Magdalene. And so any argument would have to deal with that, with the beloved disciple being a different person than Mary Magdalene in John chapter 20. There are a couple of scholars, though, who have discussed the passage that you reference at the cross. Sandra Schneiders, who has also done a Women Erased talk, and also Esther de Boer, and they make the argument that at least in that passage you can read Mary as the beloved disciple. Sandra Schneiders points out that there is no man in the list. It just says standing at the foot of the cross was the mother of Jesus, his mother and the sister of his mother, Mary of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene, therefore seeing the disciple whom he loved standing by. There is no man in that list, so there might be like a suddenly materializing person. Sandra Schneiders points out that that's difficult grammatically. And Esther de Boer points out that when Jesus says, "Woman, behold your son," that Jesus could be speaking of himself rather than the beloved disciple. So the son isn't necessarily the beloved disciple. It could be Jesus himself. So that's an interesting reading. That's the work that's been done on the subject by Sandra Schneiders and Esther de Boer. But John 20 is the trick, because Mary Magdalene runs to the beloved disciple in that. So that has to be dealt with. I hope that answers your question.
Thank you, Evangeline. Let's see, we've got Barbara Quinby. You're next up.
Great. I have a question that has always bothered me. And every time they discuss Luke 8:2, where the 7 demons have gone out, the stress is always on the 7 demons. I have never heard a homilist talk about Matthew 12:28, where he says, if it is by the Spirit of God that I drive out demons, then the kingdom of God has come upon you. I've never heard it mentioned that Mary Magdalene has the kingdom of God upon her.
That's really lovely. I like that. I don't think I know of any kind of link with that either. And it is important, it makes you think of Jesus driving out of the demons of Legion, and that being this incredible miracle. And there would have been originally a Mary Magdalene healing story, but we only have a selected number of Jesus healing stories as an indication that he did so many. He was such a magnificent healer, and the gospel writers have chosen to focus on some. They do include some women, but they've decided not to include the incredible healing of Mary Magdalene as a focus story. And maybe if they had chosen to include that would, all these sorts of things would have played out. There would have been more about what then happened in terms of Mary Magdalene and her association with Jesus. But we've got to remember that along with our ancient texts, there were oral stories still being circulated at the time these ancient texts were written down. And that's where 2nd century evidence about Mary Magdalene can also be really important, because it shows you that she was a very vital figure close to Jesus through the 2nd century. But thank you for that. I really like that.
Because that to me is more important. As a disciple, that she has a presence, and same thing with Luke 17:21, for behold, the kingdom is within you. Both of those passages place her, the 7 demons aren't so much important, but it's important is she's got the presence of God with her.
Yes,
that's exciting to me.
Exactly. This is the past. They have gone now. They've gone.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Thanks, Barbara. What a great question. Wendy, Sister Wendy? Is that Sister Wendy? You have to unmute, Wendy.
Yes, I'm a New Testament professor from Loyola University in Chicago. I'm emerita now, but this is right in my field. Let me just say to the previous sister that in that 8:1-4, the purpose of Luke is to talk about the women who gave to Jesus and the apostles out of their huparkonton, which is often translated as resources, but actually is better translated of their collateral, of their bank account, if you want to say. They're the women who are mentioned because they're writing big checks. And the emphasis is not on Mary Magdalene's casting, the demon part. It's, but anyway, I want to mention about Luke. He's famous for not knowing geography. I'm sorry. He's a very good article to read on this is C.C. McGowan. And he did the work on it in 1938. And he showed how, and more recently, John Kloppenborg has revisited Luke's gospel and his use of geography. I think it's called like knowledge, ignorance, sources, and spatial conceptions. For him, he shows how Luke just uses geography in the shape of where he's going to put his stories. And in biblical scholarship, we have a lot of questions as soon as we move into the 2nd century, because we're talking to people who are, generations away from the reality of the Greco-Roman world of the 1st century. So I want to say that. And about the beloved disciple, the first time a beloved disciple shows up is at the Last Supper, when he lays his head against Jesus' chest. So that's where the beloved disciple is first mentioned. And I believe that Father Brown, Raymond Brown, had said that it's very, very mysterious, just as you've said, and quite possibly the community of John himself trying to insert themselves at all the right places. But it's very problematic, and your review of the questions is is so erudite. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks. Yeah, and that's a great point about Luke. I appreciate you sharing that. I think our main point that we want to make is that everyone seems so certain that we know that Mary comes from this place, but there really is no certainty if you put a magnifying glass on the actual evidence. And in fact, Professor Taylor said this, but I just want to emphasize it again. Nobody actually says that she comes from the place today called Magdala until the 6th century.
But you see, Elizabeth, to cite Luke is almost using him as evidence, in another way. But we when it comes to geography in Luke, he really isn't reliable. I could give you examples, but this is your program.
About Luke's geography. We're just
and also Acts. 3 big scholars are showing that we've got another authorship going on in Acts, which is even later than Luke. So we've got problems of dating there and distance. But anyway, that's the position that most biblical scholars would take.
I think most would say that Luke and Acts are by the same author, but there might be.
They are right now. That is the status questionis. But on the horizon, we've got good scholarship to say that the Greek is different. Coming up, it will be in the next generation.
Very good. I love these exchanges. They're great.
That's right.
Thank you so much. So Victoria McDonald, do you have a question?
Thank you both so much for this wonderful presentation. In my own research, I came upon a French scripture scholar. You probably know him, Leloup. Does that sound familiar? And I think he was the one that posited that Mary Magdalene, or Mary Tower, really might have been that she was a Ethiopian priestess of Isis, which would have made her tall and black. And Jesus would have really probably loved her priestess of Isis history. And I don't know if that was anything that you uncovered in your own scholarship.
We didn't go down that track. I know that from various books that have been written about Mary Magdalene as a kind of divine feminine and goddess, Lynn Pinknett. I'm sorry, I can't remember.
And also Margaret Starbird.
Yes, Margaret Starbird. Yes, so there's a whole number of scholars that have picked that up in terms of that particular track of looking at Mary Magdalene, but it is not something that we have explored in our particular research.
Okay, thank you then. Thanks so much.
Thanks, Victoria. So we have Beth Maxfa. I'm sorry, I messed that name up.
Dear friend Beth.
Hello. Always good to hear Libbie's research, and so nice to hear yours, Joan. Dr. Taylor, I'm a student at Vanderbilt Divinity School getting a master's of theological studies, so I hope you'll bear with me. I have a burning question that I've had for a couple years, and I was thrilled to learn, Dr. Taylor, that your research on the first century Jewish women philosophers was used by Sue Monk Kidd in her book, The Book of Longings, to talk about the therapeutic community. And I heard that from her when I asked her this question. But my question for you is, I'd just love to hear your thoughts about the connection between academic research and modern popular fiction, because I assume a lot more people now know about the therapeutic through that popular fiction book than may have read the first century women Jewish philosophers. And I just wanted to ask if you knew that and what you think about your research in this popular book, and just wanted to raise that question.
Yes, it's wonderful to see modern fiction writers do their work and read the work that we do as academics. Often they do not even try. They just put over their own particular point of view. But yes, Jewish women philosophers of first century Alexandria was not a New York Times bestseller. So I'm very glad she picked up something of my work. But what can I say? It's not many people know about the therapeutes. They're just a group of Alexandrian Jews who also had quite an egalitarian male-female community, men and women living together, living a very ascetic life, a life of renunciation. Early Christian ascetics, the early monastics looked to them actually as a foundation for their own type of asceticism in the 3rd, 4th, 5th century. So they actually were very important models for Christian ascetic devotion. But yes, I'm very glad she did pick up on what I have written.
Well, she totally gave you credit.
Thank you.
I just want to say she's also very nice, because I was teaching, because she mentions the Thunder Perfect Mind in that book, and I was teaching the Thunder Perfect Mind to my class at Duke, and I put on Twitter, I said, does anybody have a copy of the Book of Longings? It's checked out from the library. Can I pick it up? I tagged her, and she lives in North Carolina, and she had her business manager drop off a copy at my front door.
Oh.
Wasn't that nice of her?
Love it.
I've never met her, but she sent her business manager to give me a copy of the Book of Longings.
Oh, I love that.
Thank you, Beth.
both so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, Beth. So Sue Monk Kidd up, Dan Brown down, right?
Oh.
Okay, Rita Houlihan.
Hi, Rita.
Hi, Rita.
Yes, it's great to speak with you, Joan, and Libbie, great to see you. Yeah, Joan and I have been in contact about some artwork. So
wonderful,
and yes,
Laura James. Laura James is brilliant.
Isn't she? Yeah, the commissioning scene. So I have a couple of points. I've bbeen reading intensely about Mary Magdalene, though I'm absolutely not a scholar. But there are a couple of points I wanted to just point out. One is I took some screenshots, but I missed the one where I think, Libbie, you were saying there was some ancient writer who asserted that there were two Magdalenes because one appeared at the tomb in the.
Yes.
Well, okay. Well, he's wrong, because in Matthew 28, I have my little cheat sheet of every single text. In Matthew 28, 1-2, it says, after the Sabbath, as the first day of the week was dawning, Mary Magdalene and the other Mary went to see the tomb. So, and then Mark, it's the same thing. And very early on the first day, and the same thing in Luke and John. So
I need to look at the Greek. I'll double check, but Eusebius is a pretty good scholar. He's one of the most important bishops of the 4th century. He was Constantine's biographer, and he wrote the history of the church. There was some discrepancy between Matthew and John he had a problem with, but I'll double check the Greek on that.
Yeah, it'd be interesting. I'd love to know if the translation is incorrect, because it's both the New American Bible and the NRSV have early, ekton for Matthew. The other thing is, I don't know if you know the scholar Mary T. Malone. She was she's Irish, and she's retired, and she taught in Canada for years. But she wrote this series called Women in Christianity, and volume 1 I've just delved into. Chris Schenck recommended it, and in it she asserts that Jerome was not a great linguist, and that he relied on Paula the Elder. And one of my fantasies for the next commissioning of art I do is to insert Paula in all, go back to the paintings of Jerome, writing away in the cave. And he was writing in luxury. She built a monastery for him in Jerusalem because he had been exiled because he was such a cantankerous chap. And I believe she also, Mary Malone asserts that I think Paula the Elder, who was very, very wealthy, hired Hebrew scholars to train him. Anyhow, and also asserts that Paula knew Greek better than he did. So it's interesting to see that there was this. For one thing that's absolutely sure is he completely relied on her sponsorship. He wouldn't have had a place to live if she hadn't built this monastery, basically, for him. And so the other thing I would love to encourage, and I'll share the Laura James art with you, but I'd love to get her art into your presentation, maybe really showing the actual text. I know the attachment to the red egg icon, I feel like, it didn't really happen, or maybe, there is a legend around it, but anyhow. But the other thing that's really been bugging me a little bit, because I saw your first presentation, Libbie, on the Lazarus, the Martha, Maria, is I can see that, he could have had one sister. But to me, that doesn't prove that it was Mary Magdalene. And in fact, I thought in John, because he's so specific, he brackets John 20 with Mary Magdalene at the beginning and Mary Magdalene again at the end to make sure you know who she is. I don't know. It just, but I sort of like the idea that Lazarus did have one sister, that she performed the prophetic anointing. She had that insight. She had that capacity, that generosity of spirit, as well as believing what Jesus predicted, and that she gave the Christological state. And I sort of like that. I like that there's this Mary, this strong Mary, Lazarus' sister, and Mary Magdalene. Anyhow, that's just for what it's worth.
I recognize that there's no way to prove that Lazarus' sister Mary is Mary Magdalene, but I do think that the text implies that she might be, particularly because of John 12:7, I think it is, when he says, "Let her save the ointment for the day of my burial." And there's only one Mary who goes to Jesus's tomb in the Gospel of John. Also, there's a very good reason for omitting her name. Obviously, most people know that the author of John had access to Mark's Gospel. Mm-hmm. And in Mark's Gospel, Mary Magdalene is there at the cross and she's there at the empty tomb. So that wouldn't be controversial to say that Mary was at the cross and the empty tomb. But what might be controversial would be to say that she has the Christological confession or that she is the anointer. Because in Mark's Gospel, the Christological confession goes to Peter and Matthew expands it, saying that Peter is the rock that the church will be built on because of that confession. So that confession is extremely important in Mark and Matthew, and it's Peter's. So to say that the similar confession in John goes to Mary Magdalene could be very problematic. So you might just omit the Magdalene part and make parallels. And then, of course, the anointing, we all know that in Mark's Gospel, her name is also omitted, even though it will be told in memory of her. So there seems to be, if you're trying to say that Mary Magdalene is the Christological confessor and the anointer, and you know Mark's Gospel or even Matthew's Gospel, I can see why you would withhold her name and instead make subtle parallels implying that she might be Mary Magdalene. And in fact, we know that people did think she was Mary Magdalene, Hippolytus, the Manichaeans, St. Ambrose. Very long before Pope Gregory, people did think that Lazarus' sister Mary was Mary Magdalene. I'm not saying that we can prove it, but I'm saying that the idea was certainly out there. And the text of John itself does perhaps imply that by the parallelisms between John 11 and John 20.
So just one last point, and I'll let other people ask. In John, she does not bring any ointment to the tomb. That's the only gospel. And also, she never touches, and I just have to say this out loud, she never touches an alabaster jar. There's no reference in any of the resurrection scenes to her carrying a jar. And there's only one reference to perfumed oil. and it's just the women in general are bringing it. So, and I'm writing that up as like so the two linchpins for Gregory, the demons, you know, some people just, you spoke eloquently of that in the kingdom of God, and it was, you know, proven, and then she's healed in her own person, and that she's one of the few healed people who's invited to participate and continue to follow. I mean, that's more the emphasis, and that's never repeated except in the 2nd century addendum. What is repeated is that they followed, the women came up from Galilee and supported him out of their collateral. I like that translation.
Yeah,
So,
we could talk much more about all these wonderful things you're talking
Rita,
about.
you've got to enter an MDiv program.
Very good. Thank you, Rita. We would
you.
expect nothing less than your tough questions. So Kathy, you have a question.
I do, just real quick. So she's considered a woman of means, right? Because she's supporting Jesus. Does that impact on who she is in terms of whether she's a sister of Lazarus or whether she's from some small village? Because at that time, a woman didn't have the ability to be a woman of means unless they were associated with the man. Or so I'm wondering, is there some kind of connection?
Yeah,
with that?
Actually, I think it's a tricky idea to assume that she was wealthy just because she's giving of her resources. Jesus has the story of the widow's mite, in which she's given a very small amount to the temple, but that is, you know, all that she has to live on. So, so for myself, of course, there's Joanna, the wife of Chusa, who we could probably assume is a woman of means. And overall, the author of Luke Acts is interested in women of means. Clearly, you know, interested in wealth generally. What do you do in your wealth, with your wealth? This is really an important theme throughout. So we've got something of a kind of modeling of Christian women here, that they should resource the Christian movement. But whether or not she was necessarily wealthy because you're giving of your resources, I don't know about that myself. Certainly in the Middle Ages, they wanted to present Mary Magdalene as a very wealthy woman. The sister of Lazarus, the Lazarus, Mary, Martha family were very wealthy, and that's in the Golden Legend. But you can, it's really whatever resources you have, you should be thinking about giving them to the movement and then being looked after by the movement, because you then no longer have resources yourself. And it's that idea of community that sustains you. It's everyone sharing their possessions. It's everyone being together as brothers and sisters. So I think that paradigm is the key one, rather than necessarily assuming that she had a lot of wealth. That's just my own personal view.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Just the way they phrase it, she supported the ministry out of her, funds. So you figure she had something to give financially, and I'm not saying that's the only reason she followed him, but so I just wondered if that, but thank you for that answer.
Okay, thank you.
Thanks, Kathy. So we have Janet, and Barbara's back again. So, but let's keep it short because we're really, we're way after time here. So
right.
Go ahead.
Can you hear me? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So I just uncovered this book, Mary Magdalene Revealed by Megan Watterson. And I was just wondering of your opinion on that I've started reading it, but I just throw that up and ask if you would find this book reliable, informational. I mean, it says Harvard Divinity, but I'm not sure. I'm just new at this. So I'm just asking.
Mm-hmm. Do you know it, Joan? I know it pretty well, actually.
Oh, well, you answer then. You answer, but
okay.
I know it, but not as well as perhaps you do.
Yeah, I think it's. I think that Megan Watterson is. It's a bit tricky what she's doing there. You'll notice that on the cover it says that the Gospel of Mary is a feminist gospel. Yes. I would not call the Gospel of Mary a feminist gospel. I would say it's more interested in Stoicism and Platonic thought. It's really interested in, will matter be utterly destroyed or not? It has a female leader. And it's written in a woman's name, but this idea of feminism is really kind of anachronistic to put on the text. And I worry a bit that what she's doing there is she's harnessing a great need in Christianity to find this sort of support of women, and she's attaching an ancient text. She's mapping her own wishes onto an ancient text. And if you read the text, if you read the book, it's very much about her own experience. And it's really not too different from what a pastor could do with a gospel. So it's not that big of a deal. Of course, you can take any gospel text and apply your own experience to it, and that's all right. But a master's degree from Harvard Divinity School is not the same as a PhD from any institution.
Right.
A PhD requires you to engage with people that you disagree with. And a master's degree, you can just take classes on things that you like. And so it ends up becoming a bit of an echo chamber sometimes, I think, whereas I think I would trust scholars. I don't even have a PhD yet, but I think that as a general rule, it's best to trust scholars who have received and earned their PhD because they have been forced to interact with people whose views they might disagree with. And then that can inform your perspective. I don't think it's a bad thing. Megan Watterson is giving a lot of solace to a lot of people with this book, and a lot of people find spiritual meaning in it. But as far as its historicity, I think she's read a lot of Karen King, and I don't think she's read Christopher Tuckett. I don't think she's read Esther de Boer. There's a lot of specialists in the Gospel of Mary that she's engaging. She's looking at it from one perspective.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Janet. Barbara, go ahead if it's a quick one.
Okay, real quick. So there's a passage, and I couldn't find it, but it's 7 women shall compass a man. It's in I don't know where it is, but anyway. And I'm wondering, because there are almost 7 Marys, I think, around Jesus, that maybe the name Mary is not a name, as more that a title, like lady. Is that possible?
But Martha, there's been discussion about whether Martha could actually mean the lady, because Ma or Mara is Lord in Aramaic. So Ma, the Lord, the great one, Mara, lady, great lady, and Martha is a way of talking about the great lady. So it could be a title that's been knocking around. But Mariam is really was a very, very popular name in the 1st century. Moses' sister Mariam was greatly esteemed, and in ossuaries and inscriptions we've just got so many different women called Mariam. It was just widely known. So that the fact that we've got so many Marys in the New Testament is just accurate in terms of the times. There really were a lot of Marys.
And then one other thing is, has anybody done an analysis, if it's assuming that it does mean tower, has anybody gone through scripture to pull out all the passages where tower is referenced? Because every time I've looked up tower, it comes out with having a wonderful meaning, of safety and security, and the bride in Song of Songs, her breasts are like a tower, as to one finding peace. I mean, has anybody written about that, as far as just assuming that it's a nickname, which seems like nicknames were popular during this period?
Yes, I think in Bible encyclopedias you will find particular references to all the towers of scripture, but from the Tower of Babel onwards, and it goes into early Christian literature like
Shepherd of Hermas.
The Shepherd of Hermas. The tower is an important symbol of the Shepherd of Hermas as the church. So the tower is a very important kind of symbol to use if you're calling someone by that nickname. All these resonances would play into it.
Yes, because a lot of times I think that the women are representing the church, the new church that's emerging. That's kind of the feeling that I always, because of the Hebrew studies of the Bible, has got all these layers. It's not just the literal story. And when you start going down to the allegorical level, boy, things really light up when you're reading the text through an allegorical lens. Is just incredible. At least I find it that way.
Yes, well, you should read Origen.
Yes, I have.
Thanks, Barbara. So I'm really sorry, Lucy. I do think we have to call an end to this tonight. I would like to give Joan just a short moment here to show us your new book and to let everybody know that we're going to a book, or your chapter in the book that's being released that just came out, and that everybody here, just so you know, we're going to invite Joan back so that she can talk more about her new book as well. So some of the new research. So Joan, would you just hold it up and show and
yes,
tell us a little bit about it so we can.
Well, I didn't want to veer too much into this book, but it's Women Remembered. I wrote it with Helen Bond, who is principal of the Divinity School at Edinburgh University. And it's just come out hot off the press with a Hodder and Stoughton. And I think it's just in the process of being distributed in the US as well as in the UK and Europe. Apparently it's a bit slow about getting to bookshops in the US. So that can happen because it's a UK publisher. But we made a documentary, Jesus, Female Disciples, the New Evidence, in 2018, and we gave lots of talks about our documentary and eventually have managed to get time to write the book that is a spin-off of the documentary. But it's really trying to look at all of Jesus' female disciples, not just Mary Magdalene. Foremost disciple of Jesus is, of course, Mary Magdalene. But looking at Joanna, looking at the mother of Jesus, looking at Salome, the other named women, and also unnamed women that we have in the Gospels and Acts, and in Paul's letters, to really emphasize the great role that women played in the foundation of the Christian faith.
That's wonderful. Thank you so much. Again, thank you, Libbie and Joan. What a fabulous presentation.